This monument to Abraham Lincoln stands an heroic statue of the great emancipator, 19 feet high. Seated on a 12-foot armchair, Lincoln looks out through the colonnade toward the Washington Monument and the Capitol building. In adjoining halls to the north and to the south are plaques on which are engraved Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address. In the Gettysburg Address, we find echoes from the Declaration of Independence in words that speak of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I am Mortimer Adler, and this is America's Testament. In Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, we find the concluding prayerful prophecy that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. As Lincoln saw it, the Civil War, fought primarily to preserve the Union, would not only, if won, preserve the Union, but also lead to a fuller realization of the ideals of liberty and equality that Lincoln regarded as the Declaration's pledge to the future. Had Lincoln lived to complete his second term as president, he would have enthusiastically endorsed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution adopted in those years. These three amendments were the very first steps toward the establishment of political democracy in this country, a movement not completed till the adoption of the 19th and 24th Amendments in this century, finally establishing as late as 1964 truly universal suffrage in this land.
America's Testament will explore the ideas and ideals of the Constitution that challenged the world at the birth of our republic. On this program, Amendments, Bill of Rights, Mortimer Adler's guests are Henry Grunwald, former editor-in-chief of Time Incorporated, and James Hogue, publisher and president of the New York Daily News.
In the preceding programs in this series on America's Testament, we've considered the Constitution as it existed in the 18th century with only its first 10 amendments, all 18th century amendments. The central question we face today is whether that 18th century Constitution established a democracy in this country, or whether political democracy and its economic underpinnings gradually emerged with amendments adopted in the 19th and 20th century, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the post-Civil War amendments that abolished slavery and extended citizenship to the black people of this country, and the 19th Amendment, which established women's suffrage, and the 24th Amendment, which abolished the poll tax as a discrimination against those without property. The word democracy, I have to say, goes way back to the ancient Greeks, but it was not used by them, by Aristotle, by Plato, in the sense that we use it today. Nor was it used by our founding fathers in the sense in which we use it today. Madison, for example, thought that a democracy was like a New England town meeting in which the citizens participated directly, whereas a republic was a representative government. Let me set the stage for our discussion by stating what I think is our 20th century understanding of democracy, that it's constitutional government with universal, truly universal suffrage, excluding only those under the age of consent, those hospitalized for feeble-mindedness or insanity, and those in prison for felonious criminal action. Universal suffrage, constitutional government with universal suffrage, and securing all human rights, economic as well as political rights. Now, I'd like to ask you both, whether you agree or disagree, that in this sense of democracy, which is a 20th century understanding of it, that democracy certainly did not exist in the 18th century, nor even in the 19th century, and that it may not even be fully achieved by our Constitution as it stands today. What would you say to that, Mr. Grunwald?
I think it depends on what one expects of the Constitution, or any Constitution. I'm somewhat leery of contemplating or viewing the Constitution as establishing an almost perfect order on earth. I think specifically in political democracy, I don't see that we can or need to go much farther under the Constitution's
But you would agree
promise.
that it is the 20th century that established it.
It is, indeed, yes.
Would you say the same thing?
Yeah, I would agree. I would think that the first two things you mentioned, Mortimer, the most important was the constitutional government and universal suffrage, because from those two, I think, are going to flow logically the idea of the government as a representative of the people for their benefit, for their welfare.
Mm-hmm. Well, looking at those first post-Civil War amendments, those were the first steps toward political democracy in this country. And we ought to look at the amendment which reads, all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. The 15th Amendment said that the rights of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of certitude.
Interesting question is why it took another century to enfranchise women.
Not quite a century, but
Took us into another century.
Yeah, the 19th Amendment, the rights of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And then, of course, the 24th Amendment, which is the rights of the citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other taxes. Mm-hmm. Now, that's fairly in the first quarter of the century. But in the 1950s, there were many ways of keeping the blacks, other than the poll tax, from voting. Yeah, yeah. So sure. It's been very slow.
Education tests, and even today it seems to me that there's a great deal of progress that needs to be made on registration to vote.
Well, it's been very slow, and I think it's regrettable that it has been slow, but it does suggest that constitutions cannot get too far out ahead of what seems to be, if you will, the popular mood or the popular judgment.
In 1835, Tocqueville, writing Democracy in America, said we had democracy in this country. He must have had a different meaning. In fact, it is said that what he found here as so different from what he found it existing in Europe or in France, this was a country of no feudal system, all commoners, no ranks of nobility, but the democracy in the sense in which I defined it at the beginning certainly didn't exist even in Jackson's administration.
I think he was using the term in more of a social context than a strictly political one.
We think it didn't mean political. He is the man for whom democracy meant a society which had universal equality of conditions. But we didn't have universal equality. Do you think that we ought to interpret Tocqueville in 1835 not as a describer of what was going on, but as a prophet predicting what would happen eventually?
I think perhaps partly as a prophet, but I do think he should not be underestimated as a describer because, as you suggested a minute ago, compared to what he saw in Europe, compared to the states of Europe, we had gone quite a long way toward democracy, even if today we would not consider it nearly adequate enough.
Well, not politically. If you think of all the amendments that I've just read, without them you don't have political democracy really at all, do you?
By the lights of the 18th century, you had, I think it was possible to, for instance, have property requirements, certainly to have literacy requirements. In fact, the literacy requirement is something that perhaps could use some more discussion. So I don't think it's so absurd to think that we really believe that democracy to be existing here.
Well, if you go back to 1900 and look at the population of the United States, you have to say that more than half the population, human beings, by natural right entitled to political liberty and participation in political government with their own consent, were not citizens.
Sure.
The women and the black were not citizens then. In that sense, but if universal suffrage...
No, in that sense, I think you're right. Still in all, I do think that the absence of a class structure and the freedom of social movement up, down, and sideways affected him deeply. I think he certainly was prophetic in the sense of, if you look at the institutionalization that has occurred since his time of what it is necessary to have a political democracy. In the same breath, I think you could say that Franklin Roosevelt was prophetic when he really tried to codify what a Bill of Economic Rights would be.
And that's 1944.
That's right.
Very late indeed.
Yeah.
A remark is attributed to Lincoln that when he spoke of the Declaration of Independence, he said, "I do not regard it as an account of what existed, but as a pledge to the future." And it seems to me when in the Gettysburg Address, he speaks of it as a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal with all the consequences of that. He was not saying that the writers of the Declaration executed that fact. Our founding fathers were devoted to liberty. Unlike the French who said liberty, equality, fraternity, we said liberty and didn't mention equality and fraternity. But equality is a notion that I think requires some more precision. I'd like to define a society in which political equality exists as follows, that all, except the few that are justly disfranchised, are haves, in the sense that they all have the right status of citizenship, they all have suffrage, they all govern with their own consent, they all participate in government, but some of the citizens have more power, some of the haves have more and some have less. Citizens in public office, as a result of the power conferred by the Constitution on those offices, have more power than citizens, ordinary citizens. So you have equality in which there are no unjustified have-nots. Would you take that as?
I would agree with that, yeah.
Well, if that's the definition of political equality, it certainly is true that in the beginning with the Second Reform Act bill in England in 1863, which extended suffrage to the working classes for the first time, we began to make politically equal those who were very unequal economically. The next question is, should we now make those who are politically equal also economically equal? In other words, the second question is more difficult than the first. We managed to give to suffrage to the poor as well as to the rich, the propertied and the unpropertied classes, the working classes and the owners. But can we now try to make economically equal those whom we've just made politically equal? Before you answer that question, let me see if I can give you a parallel conception of economic equality. Society has political equality in it if all are political haves, except for the justified exclusions. Then wouldn't a society in which there's economic equality not be one in which everyone has the same amount of wealth, which is absurd, but all are economic haves, with some economic haves having more and some having less, where an economic have, I would think in terms of the Declaration of Independence, means that they have whatever any one human being needs to lead a decent human life. Below that, not just poverty, but serious deprivation. We don't have that now, do we?
No, I think we've made an awful lot of progress, but I also think that it's a much more difficult problem because it even involves definitions. For example, it seems to me the most difficult part of a set of economic rights is the question of jobs. And do you or do you not guarantee somebody a job as part of a Bill of Economic Rights? Now, we have not gone that far, and we have...
The Bill of Economic Rights that Roosevelt did that, yeah.
He did. But I'm talking about in practice, we haven't gone that far. What we have done since 44 is to work in almost all other parts of it. Medical safety nets, old age safety nets, unemployment safety nets. And as far as a job is concerned, we have worked at that in terms of trying to define the qualities of the work environment, what's safe, what's fair, and so on. But we found no way to get to, and one of the richest societies in the world, actually guaranteeing somebody a job. Now, I suppose you could say that as long as you guarantee them what they would have had if they had a job, that is an income, you've done the same
welfare
thing.
Payments are like
but
that.
What we are learning, it seems to me, Mortimer, is that that's not true. That for me to put money in your hand is not the same thing
as having a job.
Having a job and what effect it has on you,
and
your family,
no
and the
question
society.
about it.
I think that however desirable it might be, it is absolutely impossible either in the Constitution or even in the law passed by Congress to guarantee everybody employment. It is impossible to do that except in a socialist system, and even there it doesn't work as we know. I think what we can do, and I think what the Constitution probably implies, is that, as you said before, Mortimer, that people should have the minimum that they need to lead a decent life, although I hesitate even to use that phrase because, as Jim says, definitions are difficult. What's a decent life? I think the welfare system as it now exists in West Germany or Sweden is probably considered by many people there as the absolute minimum, and yet it is bankrupting those nations. So we are on very dangerous ground here.
But difficult question as it is, let's stay with it for a moment.
All right.
In 1910, in a marvelous speech called The New Nationalism. Theodore Roosevelt said, "No man can be a good citizen unless he has a wage more than sufficient to cover the bare cost of living and hours of labor short enough so that after the day's work is done, he will have time and energy to bear his share of the management of the community to help carry the general load." We keep countless men, didn't mention women yet, we keep countless men from being good citizens by the conditions of life which surround them. I think that's absolutely true. And it's true right now, isn't it?
Well, but it's also a fairly idealistic view. You give a lot of people a great deal of free time. They don't always use it as nicely as that, as we've learned.
That's our educational responsibility.
I mean, I think Jim has a very important point here. In fact, I was going to ask you that, Mortimer, even though you are the interrogator. If a justification for a very broad interpretation of welfare, for a welfare clause, is that people really need a decent life in order to be good citizens, what do they owe the state in return? If they then are not good citizens, despite everything the state does for them, isn't there a disparity here? Isn't there a basic injustice there? And why is it that in the entire Constitution and in the literature about the Constitution, there is only talk about rights, but never about duties or obligations?
Well, there should be, of course. I mean, every right carries with it a duty and obligation.
But that is at best implicit and rarely stated.
That's right. And while I admit that most people given more free time would misuse it, that's our responsibility as educators. We've failed miserably in the school to teach them how to use their free time.
I'd go further than that. I'd say it's in human nature, which is why representative government is so appealing, which is that most people want to say, look, I want to turn over to you the running of public life, but every once in a while I want to be able to pull your chain if you're doing it wrong.
In 1912, Roosevelt, after that speech, ran, as you know, for the presidency on the Bull Moose Party, the progressive. And one of the clauses in his platform, I'm always fascinated by this, was for every working man in the United States, 1 day's rest in 7. Now that meant that a large number of human beings were working 7 days a week. And just simply, a man that works 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, can't be a good citizen.
That's right.
We have moved in advance of that, of course. But those who are seriously deprived of economic goods, it seems to me, are impeded from being responsible citizens.
I think there is a second and perhaps even stronger reason why poverty and destitution is an affront. It is an affront to a decent society as crime is an affront, and that these are things that should be solved. I am somewhat skeptical, however, of tying these solutions too closely to the Constitution. I think it's very dangerous to overburden a Constitution with very specific things.
The question is whether or not this can be accomplished by legislation, not by...
It seems to me that one of the...
How it's being accomplished is another question.
It's another question.
But, you know, you have three things that it's important to keep in mind at all times on how things get accomplished in this country, it seems to me. One is what the government does itself. The other is what it incentivizes. And the third is what happens in the private sector, which is so enormous and important. Let's take this devilish issue of jobs again. Most of the things Teddy Roosevelt pointed out have since become fact.
Right, correct.
Now, as difficult as guaranteeing everybody as a job may appear at this point, there is a lot going on in this country along those lines. For example, one of the more important experiments is called the Boston Plan, in which private companies are trying to guarantee anybody who will graduate from high school in the Boston area a job. Now, it's from these kinds of various things that go on in the private sector as well as in the public that you get this constant movement and change towards a greater fulfillment of the democratic process in this country.
But let me come back for a moment to the question of economic rights. Our founding fathers in the 18th century, and certainly through the 19th century, the notion of economic rights didn't exist. The word rights meant political rights. I think the first indication of a sense of economic rights was a little book by a member of the faculty at the Catholic University of America, Monsignor Ryan, who wrote a book called A Living Wage, in which he said that every very good opening section, I think, properly explaining what human or natural rights are, that it is a natural right for everyone to have a decent livelihood. That I think all the other economic rights are contained in that, a decent livelihood. I'd like to offer you what I think is a definition of the economic goods that go into a decent livelihood. A decent supply of the means of subsistence, not starvation, living and working conditions conducive to health, medical care, opportunities for access to the pleasures of sense, the pleasures of play and aesthetic pleasures, opportunities for access to the goods of the mind through educational facilities in youth and adult life, and enough free time from subsistence work or toil, both in youth and adult life, to take full advantage of these opportunities. That's more than having a job. Some of those things go beyond even a living wage.
Well, I think they're all desirable, obviously, and I think they all are part of a good society. I would greatly hesitate to try to bring them about through legislation, let alone through constitutional amendment.
I would be less hesitant. I mean, a great deal has occurred in these areas through legislation. I would be hesitant in terms of trying to attach it to the Constitution itself. My own feeling about the Constitution is that we are very lucky to have what we have, and that we shouldn't tamper with it. And most societies have to learn how to build a constitutional base without a written constitution to start with. And then once it's done, then it's a question of how it's interpreted and how you accrete around it. For example, the Economic Bill of Rights in this country has essentially been fleshed out by actions that have nothing to do with the Constitution.
Right.
But they now sit there in a kind of a permanent, unwritten form, as Ronald Reagan, by the way, found out.
That the Economic Bill of Rights, let me read again the FDR famous State of the Union message of 1944, the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, unemployment, the right to a good education. Now, some of these were already achieved by our entitlements, right? By the welfare legislation. Why couldn't they all be achieved by
Well, I don't think that all could be achieved. I think some, as you say, have been achieved, and I agree with Jim that legislation has taken, of course, has played an important and very legitimate part in achieving them. But there are some things in that list that I think are totally unrealistic. I don't see how, unless we invent a totally closed, economically closed society, we can protect our businessmen against the monopolies abroad. I don't see how we can guarantee every farmer a certain amount of income, even though the farm system as a whole, unfortunately, has become, economically speaking, rather obsolete. So I don't think that even FDR could simply legislate away the marketplace or reality. But if you will grant me a few of those limitations, I think much of it has been achieved. More can be.
And would you say it should be?
It should be. Should be. I would also say that more can be achieved. I think that maybe I'm getting ahead of the argument here, but I think in terms of total gross national product share devoted to social welfare in this country is probably adequate. I think what is not adequate is its distribution, which is inefficient and cumbersome, but perhaps that's another part of the story.
You have no sense that the amount of our wealth that we devote to military establishment, national security and defense interferes with our using that same wealth?
The fact of the matter is, Mortimer, that in terms of share of GNP, our military expenditures have steadily declined and our social expenditures have steadily increased. I'm not saying that every billion we spend for defense is defensible and necessary. I'm sure that things could be trimmed. But if you look at the society or the economy as a whole, proportionately what we spend on the military has gone down.
You agree to that?
Oh, I do agree to that. And I think the answer to your question is yes, but it's a different one than Henry was raising. It sure does interfere, but what's the choice? And I mean, at this stage, I think we have to have a relatively high level of national security expenditures. And the main issue at the moment would appear to be on that front, how it's spent. We're talking about a Bill of Economic Rights, which not only depends on a society wanting to grant itself this and having a constitutional framework, formal or informal, that can embrace it. But it also requires a market economy that is going to stay healthy and probably be expanding over long cycles of time. Just take guaranteeing everybody a job. We do have a form of that in legislation. It's called full employment legislation. Now, you have to play with the language so that not everybody is actually guaranteed a job. But that bill is only effective in good times. It's not particularly effective in bad times.
But In a previous discussion in this series, we spent some time on the meaning of the phrase in the preamble, promote the general welfare.
Yeah.
And I think with some qualifications, we decided that that was a significant phrase distinct from the other elements in the preamble, only if you understood it as Hamilton understood it, as a general economic welfare, economic prosperity, and economic prosperity participated in by the families of this country. The word welfare, by the way, then became adopted in the 20th century, welfare society, welfare legislation. So that in some sense, we not only have achieved, we've moved to our political democracy in this century for the first time, but we've moved also towards promoting the general welfare in this century for the first time, but we haven't gone far enough, it seems to me. You mentioned a permanent underclass in this country. Everyone has a sense that the middle class is disappearing. We have a wider gap between the very poor and the well-off. But democracy won't work that way any more than it'll work with citizens who aren't well educated.
Well, it won't work that way, of course, but it also won't work if you spend too much on trying to equalize everybody's economic station.
No, not equalized in the sense of the same amounts.
Yeah.
But if we go back to the meaning of equality, that there shall all be economic haves, that no one shall be seriously deprived, aren't there? Wouldn't you say that right now in this country there are many seriously deprived persons?
There are many seriously deprived persons. I think they need not be if we could rearrange the distribution of the resources we spend on welfare more effectively. But I would like to raise a perhaps theoretical point, not to undermine what you're saying, meaning that in a decent society this crass poverty should not exist. But I do think that in what I hear and read, there's a frequent confusion between rights, as in economic Bill of Rights, and entitlements. A right to, it seems to me in the Constitution, politically speaking, and therefore by extension economically, is to try for something, to have an open opportunity to try for something. It does not guarantee you results. It seems to me that you ought to be free to the best you can to find a job. No. You ought to be free to own property if you can acquire it. But I think the result cannot be guaranteed.
I think I disagree with you, Henry, about that, because when I say I have a right to political liberty, a right to be a citizen with suffrage and to be governed with my own consent, I'm talking about something I'm entitled to.
Yeah.
When I talk political rights, I'm talking about entitlements, am I not?
Well, but for instance, when it comes to the right to property, I can't believe can't believe that means that you're entitled to own property.
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah. I don't. Okay, well, so there's a distinction between economic rights and.
I'm not sure I'd acknowledge a right to property in that sense. You see?
Yeah, okay.
Well, I suppose in a democracy now you would say a right to property, if broadly interpreted, means something that it doesn't necessarily mean land.
It means property or the economic equivalence of property.
It means a wage, a pension, whatever, yes.
You have a right to the sources of wealth, you see.
One point I wanted to make on this business of should we move further and can we? Well, I think the answer is yes, but I don't think that the answer is yes in the sense that the government should be the only provider of these economic rights by grant, so to speak. In fact, I think if we were to look at the current situation, that one of the things that disturbs me most is not what level of expenditures we have in terms of government funds, but how we have skewered the incentives. And it seems to me this is one of the most important roles the government plays in a democracy, through the use of its tax powers, through the use of its recognition powers. It can cause some things to happen versus others, or at least incentivize the private sector to concentrate on that. If what we're talking about represents what one should have in a political democracy, three things we are not paying very much attention to right now and should be as a society are manpower retraining, which would do more to solve some of the job problems than anything else, research, and educational expenditures. And in all three areas, we're cutting back.
Yeah.
Now, to spend money in these areas does not necessarily mean that government is granting you the right, but they are creating the environment in which the right can be realized.
I would absolutely endorse that with the one footnote that, especially in the education area, mere expenditure of money is not enough. And this gentleman here, Mortimer, you of all people know that. Yeah. And what we need is not just money for education. We need some more intelligent approach to education. Right. And that applies to many other social issues.
I have a sense, what both of you said, and I don't disagree with it, but I'd like to have it explained. Talking about political rights and being clear what should be done about realizing them, As you've noticed, we've achieved political democracy by amendments to the Constitution and by legislation in support, suffrage amendments and the civil rights legislation in the 50s and 60s. But I gather you think that if there are economic rights, somehow parallel to political rights, they can't be achieved by legislation or amendments in the same way. I mean, in other words, the two kinds of rights and the two kinds of equality.
I think they can be achieved by legislation, but I think they don't lend themselves to constitutional amendments because you can't easily quantify them. As you can a political right.
And I would even say that while they can be helped along and supplemented and so on through it, or stimulated through legislation, the economy, any economy, is such a complex system or congeries of systems that it's very difficult to just legislate it.
There is a constant battle over what is an adequate level of medical coverage, and there always will be. There is not much of a battle over whether a woman is a woman and therefore can be identified as one who should have a political right. You know.
But would you say that, taking the Soviet Union as the example of the communist state, the socialist society, that they have achieved these economic rights by legislation and by political organization?
Yes, they have achieved these economic rights at a tremendous cost. First of all and foremost, at the cost of political liberty, but also secondly, at the cost of vast economic inefficiency, because while everybody more or less theoretically has a job, even if it is a meaningless job of paper shuffling, the economy as a whole, as we know, as Mr. Gorbachev knows, is simply not productive.
But that suggests that my thinking of the economic affairs in parallel with political affairs is incorrect. What you're saying is that though the economic underpinnings of democracy are important, they can't be achieved the same way that the democratic equality is
Let me
achieved.
go back to the political argument for a moment, or the mechanics of a society. It seems to me, no, I don't think you can, to give you a straight answer, handle the economic agenda through a constitution. It seems to me what a constitution can do is to set up a set of ground rules and a piece of mechanics that, more than anything else, guarantees the continued process of change and the ability of important agendas to get heard when it is their time to get heard. So that whether we're talking about economic rights or whether we're talking about social rights or a whole list of things that cannot be incorporated forever into a constitution, it is that ability, it is the process that allows change that becomes the most important thing.
I think a lot can be done through legislation. I think, for instance, a scheme of Richard Nixon's on the negative, so-called negative income tax, I always thought made a lot of sense and would perhaps redirect all the different expenditures we now have in a more sensible way. So that things like that are susceptible to legislation. But the fact is, Jim mentioned the full employment law. I mean, that's a totally meaningless law. You cannot sit in Congress and say there shall be full employment, or even if you define full employment as 5% unemployment, you can't do it. An economy that is productive and capitalist, or even partly capitalist, cannot be commanded in such a way. That's all I'm saying. But you can do a lot through legislation. We have.
And we can do more than we do.
Yes, I'm sure we can do more.
I would also come back again to how much can be done by how the government uses its abilities to incentivize the private sector.
Yeah.
And very often that's a far more productive way to go than through legislation.
Can you give some examples of that?
Well, sure. As I said, the tax policy is probably the most important. Depending on what kinds of deductions I give you, I can incentivize you to save. I can incentivize you to send your kids to college. I can incentivize you as a businessman to provide a healthy environment. I incentivize you two ways, by what kinds of incentives I set up and what kind of penalties I set up. And recognition, which is a non-monetary form. Government has a lot to do with determining what gets recognized.
Let's take health for a moment. Obviously, under the present conditions of the cost of medicine, a very small part of our population can afford to pay for the health care they need, correct?
Correct.
And there the state, by such things as Medicare and Medicaid, provides something that persons who very well can provide for themselves, but others must be provided for out of the public purse, correct?
Correct.
Similarly, our state institutions of education, a very small part of this population could afford to pay the cost of private education at the present moment of college education, yet the state provides college education for, aren't those ways in which the state government acts to provide forms of wealth that some people can buy but others must receive?
Sure, absolutely.
But wouldn't it be better, I mean, you both have a sense that receiving welfare payments in the order is degrading, a job is earning. Wouldn't it be better if everyone could, by their own efforts, obtain the means of subsistence, the comforts and conveniences of life, without being handed out from the government?
Sure.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
Well,
what makes sense, it seems to me, is at the heart of an awful lot of things that add up to a good working political democracy. Pragmatism is a very important factor here, and that's a wonderful idea, but it doesn't make sense. Can't be done. How are you going to legislate that?
I'm not sure you can legislate it. The question is, can the economy be reorganized such a way that is obtained? Certainly this is true, isn't it? The three forms in which people obtain wealth: one by wages, which is earned through wages and salaries alone; one by the dividends of capital; and one by welfare payments. Now, the third, it seems to me, is the least desirable.
Yeah, I think all three can be useful. I think welfare payments, the argument here is how that program is structured, not that there is such a program. At least that's the case with me. I think you have to have a welfare program.
Absolutely.
I think we've set it up in such a way as to get the worst out of it rather than the best. As far as owning part, in the modern sense, property, owning, say, stock in the capital system, that has been kind of a great American idea for the last 25 or 30 years, and it's probably a very good one. And again, the government, if it perceives this as being a good way of transferring and spreading wealth, can incentivize it. Now, at times they do, and at times they don't through the tax legislation. The first one, of course, is the most difficult to guarantee, which is that thou shalt have a job under all circumstances.
Well, you've now said you're not necessarily saying it should be guaranteed. No. We ought to somehow find a way of bringing it about, and I think that it's tremendously complicated and has two elements. One is, of course, structuring the economy, the private sector in such a way that jobs are created, or that when jobs disappear, people, as Jim says, will be retrained, new industries, new businesses will spring up. All that is much easier said than done. But another element lies in the word effort that you used, by people's own efforts. I'm not one who goes around telling stories about welfare cheats and so on. Yeah. But the fact is that the willingness to put in effort it should not be underestimated. No. If you look at Japan, for instance, or some other societies which have other problems but don't have some of our problems, the national ethos of effort and work is a very important element in that. And I'm not certain that in the 200 years since the Constitution was written, we haven't lost some of that.
We have.
We've gained some things, but we also lost some.
It says the welfare system, badly, I think, set up, encourages idleness and avoidance of work. I mean, whole families, generation to generation, avoid having jobs. They prefer to live on welfare.
It's not their fault. It's how we set it up, as you said.
That's right.
You know, what about using welfare with a small w or in the broad sense, that there will be a safety net of medical, old age, maybe even educational things underneath all citizens. It's my feeling we passed a watershed on that in our own time, in the last decade. I think the Reagan administration was the first since the New Deal in which there was really going to be a testing of whether there should be a fully constructed welfare state as part of the permanent American environment, from the middle class on down. Yeah. And I think it is now quite clear that it is a permanent part of the environment, that the middle class of America, even in tough times, it just insists now that this safety net be there. So it's not written in the Constitution, but it's like the British Constitution. It is now a part of the political heritage, and I think except for arguments over how it's done and at what degrees of expenditure, it's a part of the political landscape.
To me, it's not in the Constitution so much as it's in the Declaration. If all men are equal by nature, and if they're all equally endowed with unalienable rights, if these unalienable rights are their human needs, and if economic rights are among these unalienable human rights, the Declaration says a just government should aim to secure these rights by legislation or constitutional provisions. I have the feeling that the Constitution should never be read outside the context of the Declaration. The Declaration contains political principles. The Constitution doesn't contain political principles. And if you take the Preamble and the Declaration, then the Constitution is asking for this, though I think our founding fathers didn't know that.
I agree with Jim that the safety net, or whatever you want to call it, has become an absolutely indelible part of the landscape. I do think that as it is set up now, the middle class benefits too much. I think many people benefit too much who could make a greater contribution either through workfare or whatever. And I also think that I want to come back to this business about equality of opportunity.
That's what really makes the point. I agree with you.
Yeah.
The middle class does benefit too much, but the middle class has said that's the way it's going to be.
The middle class will not give it up unless really forced. It's not totally impossible. The middle class could be forced through a sort of cataclysmic series of economic troubles or whatever.
The middle class is the American majority, is it not?
Of course. But I want to introduce, if it's not out of order, this notion of equality and equality of opportunity versus equality of result, which is something that Dan Bell has written about a lot and others. I do think that we have redefined equality to some extent to mean that the outcome has to be either guaranteed or even has to be quantitative on a certain level, rather than emphasizing equal opportunity. And I think that's a problem, partly because it's a theoretical problem because it is perhaps unjust philosophically, but it's also impractical because it's very costly.
I disagree with
You disagree with that?
At least in part, in this sense. I don't think there's a fine line between equality of conditions going to the game, so to speak, and distributive equality. I think there are extremes of either, but in the middle is probably where the game is played. And the essential American idea, it seems to me, is that there will be an equal starting line for everybody.
That's opportunity.
That's opportunity, but we've gone beyond...
You get inequality of results.
But we've gone beyond that to say that there has to be at least some equality of distribution.
Or results.
All right, maybe same thing.
Well, there are two problems. Sorry.
Let me just say, to the other end of the spectrum, it seems to me also we have said that while there should be an inequality of result, that's part of the process, there cannot be too great an inequality of result, or that lends itself to political and economic problems. Therefore, at the bottom end, you do have some efforts made to see that there's some distribution, and at the top end, you are having efforts made to control anyone having too much.
Let me see, if I
Fairness has to be the biggest thing.
I think what you're saying is what I'm saying too, but I think I'm saying it's outside different language. When I say they all should be halves, that's the limiting factor. And that is, they're halves in terms of their common human needs. Again, if I'm right about this, we all have the same natural rights because we have the same natural needs, and those needs gives us what we have to have in order to be human life. Now, above that, the inequalities of distribution, I think, properly are in accordance to contribution. If some contribute more, they should receive more. So that among the haves, you have mores and have lesses. That inequality exists in Russia, it exists here.
Well, I certainly would agree in principle to measuring people's contributions. In practice, it's very difficult.
Very difficult.
How much does a Wall Street arbitrageur contribute to the society? I don't know. Maybe he contributes something that's quite important. But getting back, Jim, even to the starting line, I mean, the agreement that the starting line should be more or less equal. We would agree that if people don't have a decent education, the starting line can't be equal. But how far do you push it back?
I can never forgive Jefferson for always regarded as a great Democrat, for his education proposal at the University of in Virginia. In 1817, Jefferson, I think this was the first education bill proposed in the United States. He said to the legislature, let us give all the children of Virginia 3 years of schooling at the public expense. And after 3 years, let's divide them into those who are destined for labor and those who are destined for leisure and learning. Let us send those who are destined for labor into the shops as apprentices, onto the fields as hired hands. Let us send those who are destined for leisure and learning after 3 years to college. And they did go to college. They graduated at 13. The legislature of Virginia defeated the bill, quite properly on the grounds that those who are destined for labor didn't need 3 years of public school. And that mentality of those destined for labor and those destined for leisure and learning, I think, dominated very largely.
Well, as a European concept.
Still a concept that's still not that in Britain, for instance.
Yes.
And you can find it in one form in Japan.
Yes. But again, undemocratic, is it not? We have the obligation now to treat all the children as if they're destined for labor and for leisure and learning.
Well, I just want to complicate the problem. I think there's a general sense that the public education system in the United States is not doing its job the right way.
That I have heard.
And that indeed it was better at another time.
I think it was better when I went to school.
So simply democratizing it and making the resources available to all does not seem to be the answer if a part of justice is to make sure that you get a good education if that's what you want.
Well, as a matter of fact, I would think the change in the schools from the time that I went to school to the very first decade of this century and now, the decline of education, of schooling, has been a consequence of the democratization.
Yes, absolutely.
It seems to me now we're at the point of reverse. When I say now that the American school system is undemocratic, fundamentally undemocratic, because we still are doing what Jefferson, we're still dividing the students into the college-bound and the non-college-bound. I say it's not surprising that we still have a totally undemocratic school system when democracy, in the sense which we've been discussing it in this hour, is so recent. I would suspect we won't have a democratic school system until the next century.
You say that we divide people into college-bound and non-college-bound. I think it gets more complicated than that because we push, in one way or another, a lot of people toward college who are not spectacularly qualified for it or inclined toward it, so that college really has almost become an entitlement, and a college education accordingly has become devalued.
I would agree with you about that. If we gave all the children from K through 12 a truly general liberal schooling, I wouldn't recommend that they all go to college.
Right. That's where the reform should be.
That's right.
In the lower grades.
But that we are not doing that.
We're not doing it. I agree.
I have a sense that we have reached a fair measure of agreement that political democracy is a 20th century innovation finally achieved with amendments in this century and legislation that supports those amendments. I also think that we have some sense that the economic aspect of political life has been suddenly brought to the fore in the 20th century. We have added a concern with economic equality to our previous concern with political equality and freedom, and we have added a concern about economic rights over and above our earlier concern about political rights. But my other sense is that both of you and I too, share the feeling that there is greater difficulty in handling the question of economic equality than political equality, and much greater difficulty in dealing with economic rights than political rights.
I think there is. I would say a hard view of how this works is that whoever is enfranchised tends to use the political system for their economic benefit. And as long as the numbers are narrow, then it's the nobility only that gets the payoff. And really what has happened, perhaps, is that as we created a broad political enfranchisement, it logically followed that they would begin to take the economic benefits of it. And maybe the reason why it isn't even fuller than it is that the political franchise still needs to be extended more.
How would you do that?
Well, I think we've got to make it easier to vote in this country.
What would you
I
mean by
think
that?
you've got to, well, I mentioned it earlier, but registration is one of the last tools which is used to control who votes and who doesn't by making it complicated. You can't use a poll tax anymore. You can't use an educational test, but you can still make it bloody difficult by some standards to get yourself registered to vote, or if you change your address and so on. Having elections on days when people don't work, like on a Sunday, or making it a holiday would increase. Maybe education would. In any event, my guess is that if the true term political franchisement was even further extended, you would see economic rights more broadened as well.
But I certainly would favor extending the franchise in that sense, making it easier for people to vote and encouraging them to vote, but in the sense that assumes that there are leaders, politicians with programs out there whom the people could vote for, and then the problems would come closer to the solution. I'm a little pessimistic about the available plans and programs out there. I hope that we are beginning a new surge of really rethinking these problems, but so far I haven't seen any very encouraging signs that the solutions are around the corner. One has to remember that the whole notion that poverty is an affront, that poverty can be and should be eradicated, is an absolutely brand new notion. It would have seemed 200 years ago, possibly 100 years ago, slightly insane to say that we can eradicate poverty. I think we can, and I think we will, but it's a very new idea, and it'll take some time, which is not an excuse to do nothing, but go be realistic about it.
And if I'm right, that democracy is a 20th century innovation, it would not be astonishing to say that it may take 100 and 200 years of development to bring it into full reality.
I think that's quite right. I think that's quite right.
I agree very much with what Henry said. I think programs will come and programs will go, and some are going to work and some are not. But
some that we can't even foresee.
The attention will be focused. If the political enfranchisement is broadened, then the attention on the economic problems will be focused. I'd say, I'll come back to a point I made earlier, I think it is so important to try and maintain a system which is open to change in a number of ways, because we really don't know what the agendas are going to be, and we don't know how the problems are going to align themselves. Let me give just one quick example. In the Reagan years, where we saw the federal government cutting back in the area of economic stimulus and industrial planning and so forth, we saw a lot of that being picked up in ways that could never have been expected at the state level.
Right.
In fact, some of the most innovative things being done right now to foster business and growth in this country are happening at the state level. This kind of unpredictability is one of the current real benefits of the system we have, not only the political system, but the whole social system that allows a lot of change in ways that cannot be predicted to continue to occur.
And one thing you mentioned earlier, Jim, has to do with the private sector. The private sector doesn't, I believe, appear in the Constitution. It doesn't appear in many laws, even in many statutes. But it's absolutely essential to accomplish
in our
society what we want to accomplish. We learned in the Great Depression that the private sector, uncontrolled, run amok, is a disaster.
That's right.
We've learned since then, I think, during the New Deal, Fair Deal, Great Frontier decades, that the private sector too constrained and the public sector unleashed doesn't work either.
That's right.
And it is the task of political leadership, if that's possible, to find a balance,
Desirable,
find a mixture.
certainly, if not possible.
Desirable.
Yeah. Let me take education as an example. If one of the obstacles to the fullest realization of democracy is a much better school system than we have now, radically reform one, legislation isn't going to do that.
That's right.
And money isn't going to do that either.
Exactly.
It's a better understanding of what teaching and learning are, and seeing that all the children are taken care of. There are many conditions, many requirements for the fullest realization of democracy that are not possible by constitutional or legislative measures.
That's all true, but we don't spend enough money on education.
No.
And you just have to go around city school systems to know that.
But the lack of money is not the main deficit.
I understand that, I agree, but I tell you, I'm hearing too often, not just today, it's beginning to be almost a knee-jerk response that money in education really isn't the problem. And I've got to tell you, this is a kind of a hardened street judgment, but I remember asking a very eminent Chicago politician once, why is the school system, which you came through and cared about so much, deteriorating so much in your own time as a leader? And he said, because I have a white tax system that is trying to support a black social service, and it won't work. Now, what he was saying in very tough terms is that the funding of the public school system was going down, according in relationship to the need. And I wouldn't overlook it.
It's absolutely right. I think that's true, but I also agree with you, Mortimer, that beyond money, a lot of other things are needed, including the whole morale and how we feel about education.
And a better understanding of teaching and learning.
And also how society values education. I sometimes feel that our society does not really set great store by education anymore.
That is true. And, but one of the ways of making teachers more respected would be to
pay them better.
Pay them better.
No question about that. And I'd go further. In Japan and in Europe, for the most part, a teacher, a school teacher, not a hair professor at the university level, it has the same dignity and the same status in the community as a lawyer, a physician, an accountant, an engineer. Not in this country.
Yep.
It is, though it is in some sense one of the great learned professions, it is not so treated. The other thing, my sense is that we are getting the bottom of the barrel. The young people in our schools are not going into teaching. They're going into accounting, they're going into computing, they're going into mathematics, anything else than teaching. And that many of our teachers, I think, would, if they could earn not more, but even the same amount of money to do something else, would leave the school system. Because the conditions, the life of a teacher are not good conditions. And what we have to do is give more respect to teachers and give them a better job, a job that attracts their mind rather than merely earns a salary. That's going to be hard to do. And I think we have to do that in the course of the next year. Thank you, Mr. Rumor, for being with us. Thank you, Mr. Hogue. I also wish to thank our viewers for being with us on this occasion. We hope you will join us on the fifth and last program in this series on America's Testament, a program which will discuss possible future developments and improvements in the Constitution of the United States.